Hi. So today we are going to start our discussion on chapter 12, which talks about supply chain design. Now, earlier in this course, there were two chapters, chapter 12 and chapter 14, and both of them related to the overall or the both of them related to the topic of supply chain management. However, considering our current circumstances, we would not be discussing chapter 14 in this course, and we will only limit our discussion on supply chain management to chapter 12. So, within this chapter, there are two main learning objectives. The first one is a basic introduction to supply chain management. So, we will spend something like 20 to 25 minutes, maybe half an hour, on understanding what do we mean by supply chain and what exactly is the meaning of the term supply chain management. And then we will shift our attention to creating a basic differentiation between what we call an efficient supply chain versus a responsive supply chain. Uh, so this topic of supply chain management is very, very relevant to whatever is happening around us these days. And I'm going to take several examples from our from some recent events to try to explain why managing a supply chain is very, very important. So let's start with a basic introduction. So, so in essence, a supply chain is supply. So in essence, a supply chain consists of several organizations that are connected to each other through the transfer of materials. Materials or supply. In other words, basically, it's a sequence of organizations, their facilities, functions, and activities that are involved in producing and delivering a product or a service. So, for example, uh, let's so generally a supply chain would start from the ultimate raw materials. Then there would be a supplier, and then the supplier would provide those raw materials to a factory. The factory would produce some item, and then that item will be handed over to a distributor. The distributor is going to give it to the retail, and then we, as an every consumer, buy those items from a retailer. So, in essence, this is an example of a simplified supply chain, and this is showing the supply chain of an apparel product, starting from the absolute raw material, going to the absolute end, which is the consumer. So, managing this flow of material through these series of organizations is what we call supply chain management, which is the strategic coordination of supply for the purpose of integrating supply and demand management. So for example, if you go to Target or Walmart and let's say you're looking for a detergent or you're looking for a toothpaste or a toothbrush or any other product, and you do not find that item on the shelf, it means that somewhere in this entire supply chain, the link broke. And that's why you as a customer or as a consumer were not able to find the product in the retail store. So that's it. That is in essence what we call a supply chain. Let me change the. I think I think red would be more visible. Yeah, I think it's more visible. Excuse me. So moving ahead, just to explain the supply chain of a detergent. So let's say you go to Target or Walmart and you want to buy this Tide detergent. Now, in order to get this detergent to the shelves, there is an entire series of organizations that are involved, right? So you want a detergent. So let's say you go to Albertsons, you get your product from Albertsons. So, but however, this product has reached Albertsons through a third-party distribution center, but the manufacturer of this product, Tide, is Procter and Gamble. So Procter and Gamble must have supplied this product to the distributor, and when Procter and Gamble, who was making the product, while they were making the solution, most likely the bottle, the cap, and the packaging uh, was not made by PNG. So that was made by, so let's say the cup was made by a plastic cup producer, and basically plastic comes from oil manufacturing. So obviously they supplied this, and then in order to produce this detergent, there were many chemicals, so they were provided by different chemical manufacturers. And then for packaging, you need paper manufacturer, and then paper obviously comes from the timber industry. So there are a series of firms that are involved in ensuring that this product gets to the shelf at the right time so that the customer can buy this product. And managing this entire chain is what we call supply chain management. Now, moving on. Generally speaking, if you want to simplify a supply chain, it consists of a supplier, a manufacturer, a distributor, and a retailer. And we as customers generally interact with the retailer, but there are many other components of a supply chain. Generally, we distinguish between what we call upstream and downstream supply chain members. And the distinction between an upstream member and a downstream member depends on where you are in a supply chain. So for example, if I am a manufacturer, all the supply chain members that come after me are downstream members. So if I am a manufacturer, the distributor and a retailer and the customers will be downstream and my suppliers will be upstream. But if I am a retailer, then only the customer is downstream, everything else is upstream. So the analogy is similar to how water flows in a river. So in a river, water flows from upstream to downstream. Similarly, in a supply chain, the goods flow from upstream members to downstream members. The basic goal in a supply chain is to match supply and demand. And in theory, it looks easy, but in reality, it's a very, very difficult thing to do because you have to match the demand with supply not only at the retail end, but also at the intersection of each organization. So this demand has to be met with the supply at each intersection of organizations. So earlier I said that a lot of things that are happening around us directly relate to supply chain management. And I'll give you two examples. One of them is the toilet papers shortage. And I don't have a spell check with me, but I think this is the right spelling. So what is happening in this shortage is that the demand has gone up from the customer end for the toilet paper. And since the supply chains are very long and very complex, it has taken a very long time for this supply chain to respond to this shortage. And that is why even to this day, even today, if you go to a Costco or a Walmart or a Target, you would not be able to find the toilet paper. However, if I take a slightly different example, which is milk. Now, for milk, a month back, there was a shortage because people were hoarding milk. But now, if you notice, if you go to a Costco or a Walmart or a Target, you can purchase milk from these stores. And the question is, why is there a shortage of toilet paper and not a shortage of milk? And the reason is that inherently the supply chains for toilet paper are far more complex than supply chains for milk. And it's the complexity of the supply chain that is creating a problem in terms of supply for toilet paper. And since the supply chains for milk are relatively simpler and relatively shorter, that is why the product is available in greater quantities as compared to toilet paper. So the reason I gave these two examples is because it gives us an idea of how critical it is to manage your supply chain. Now, as I said, the goal in the supply chain is to match supply and demand, but as we can clearly see from what's happening around us these days, it is not an easy task to match this demand with supply all the time. Now, why is it so difficult? The biggest issue why is it so difficult to match supply with demand is the uncertainty. the higher the uncertainty, the more difficult it would be to match supply and demand. The lower the uncertainty, the easier it is to match demand and supply. And again, I'll go back to example of toilet paper. Now, so post-COVID, it was easier to match demand with supply because the demand was certain, right? I mean, there were small changes in demand, but not huge changes. But sorry, I should say pre-COVID. So pre-COVID, the demand fluctuation was pretty stable. So let's say this is, actually let me erase it. So I'll try to explain it using a graph. Oh, okay. So let's for a second assume that this demand fluctuation started. I don't know why it keeps on having this. But anyway, let's assume this is March of 2020. And let's assume that the demand started increasing after March 2020. I mean, that's not the exact date, but let's assume that. So basically before, and this is your time, obviously, and this is your demand for toilet paper, right? There was some fluctuation even before March 2020 as well. But after this event, and I'll use a different color. Let's use blue. This is what has been happening. And the supply chain for toilet paper was not designed for this much fluctuation. And that is why any change in uncertainty creates problems for firms to match supply with demand. That's generally the biggest factor. But there are other factors as well. So changing customer requirements generally creates problems. If your supply chain is fragmented, it creates problems. So fragmentation means that different companies are involved within a supply chain. So for example, let's say this is a simple supply chain. This is form A, this is form B, and this is the customer. Now, ideally, form B would not want to have very high inventories, and let's say if they don't want to have very high inventories, then someone has to carry those inventories, and form A also does not want to carry a lot of inventory. So generally, if there are conflicting objectives within a supply chain, it creates some problems. And we will see this we will discuss this in detail when we will go to our chapter on inventory management. Because this problem of conflicting objectives is highlighted when you have to manage inventories. So let's park this point for a chapter on inventory management. So there are other reasons as well. Let me erase this. So fragmentation in a supply chain creates problem, but even if there are conflicting objectives within a single firm, that creates some problems in terms of matching supply and demand as well. So generally, marketing and sales, they want more inventory, production wants bigger batch sizes. Relatively, they want to have lesser inventory. And again, this is also something that we will discuss in detail when we go to our chapter on inventory management. So a combination of these three factors generally creates this problem where it becomes difficult to match supply and demand. Now, within a supply chain, there are different kinds of flows. Generally, goods flow from the supplier to the customer, and funds flow from the customer to the supplier. So basically, the supplier, as the name indicates, is supplying the items to the customer, and the customer is paying for those items. So funds flow in this, generally funds flow in this direction and material flow in this direction. And generally information flows in both directions. Now, because of our circumstances, we cannot play a game that was initially assigned in this course. That game actually talks about supply chain management and how there is interaction between material and information flow. So that's actually a board game. I don't want to get into the details of the game, but generally it's a lot of fun. There is a lot of activity that is involved, and people in the past have rated that game very, very highly. Unfortunately, because of our current circumstances, we cannot play that game. But I'm hoping that if some of you take the 400 level course on supply chain management, that game will be a part of that course. Now, moving on. This ends our basic introduction to supply chain management, which is the first part of the chapter. Now we will start our discussion on the second part of our chapter, which relate to the strategic options for supply chain design. So let's start with the second part. Okay, so now we will discuss strategic options for supply chain design. Now, as I said in the beginning of this chapter, basically we would be discussing two different kinds of supply chains. So the two supply chains that we will be discussing, they are generally called efficient versus I don't know why it keeps on doing that. Let me erase this. I want everyone to let me write it again. And if it does it again, then we will shift to the Zoom annotation. So basically the two most common types of supply chains are efficient, CIENT, versus, yeah, it's doing it again. Okay, responsive supply chains. Okay, so let me move to Zoom annotation and see if Zoom annotation is better. Now, generally, when we talk about efficient supply chains, the products that are the products actually that correspond to efficient supply chains, or if I use different words, efficient supply chains are generally for those products that are make to stock. Now, what do we mean by make to stock products? As the name indicates, make to stock means that the products are made to stock, or the products are made to store. Most of the products that we deal with in our everyday lives are make to stock products. So in essence, the flow chart for those products look something like this. So make to stock products are that first we forecast the demand, then we make the product based on that forecast, and then once the product is made, we store the product as finished goods inventory, so as inventory. And then when the customer asks for the product, we give the customer the product from the inventory. In other words, for make to stock products, the production is realized well in advance of the actual demand realization. Or in other words, the product is made well in advance of the actual demand realization. So that is what we call make to stock. So for example, our clothes, shoes, electronics, most of the things that we generally buy, those are make to stock products, because the producers have already made those products, they have maintained inventory of those products, And then when we as a customer want those products, we are handed over those products from the inventory, right? So generally for those kind of supply chains, generally for those kind of products, the supply chains that we need are efficient supply chains. And when we use the word efficient, the idea is that for those kind of products, the supply chains that we need are focused on less cost or cost reduction. However, there is a second kind of supply chain, which is called a responsive supply chain. So in a responsive supply chain, as the name indicates, the emphasis is on response time, not on cost. So in a responsive supply chain, the idea is to be as responsive as possible. Or in other words, the idea is to have higher delivery speed. Right? That's the main emphasis in our responsive supply chains. And there are three product categories, or there are three kinds of products for which a responsive supply chain is more suitable. So those products are assembled to order, make to order, and design to order. So what exactly are these three? Let's start with the assembled to order one. So for the assembled to order one, the idea is that there is some forecasting of the customer orders, but instead of producing the actual finished product, the manufacturer only produces sub-assemblies and keeps inventories of sub-assemblies. And only when a customer order arrives, the sub-assemblies are assembled into a final product. So in other words, the differentiation between assembled to order and make to order is, make to stock is, that there is no stock of the finished item. Only sub-assemblies are kept. And only when a customer gives an order, the sub-assemblies are assembled into a final product. So one of the examples that I can think of right now are laptops. There are many manufacturers now that do not keep an assembled laptop in their inventory. So Dell was the first one that started with it. They would only keep sub-assemblies. So by sub-assemblies, what we mean is that they'll have different capacities for their hard drives. They'll have different RAMs. So they'll have a 8 GB RAM or 12 GB RAM, etc., etc. And then they'll have different sub-assemblies of the laptops in terms of screen size, etc. And only when a customer order arrives, they will assemble those sub-assemblies into a final assembled product. So if a product is assembled after a customer order, that product is called an assembled to order product. And the supply chain that is needed for that kind of a product is a responsive supply chain, not an efficient one. The next category is make to order. And as the name indicates, make to order is when the customer places the order, you make the product. So customer places an order and the producer produces it. Generally, businesses that offer customized products or customized services are an example of make to order. So for example, customized cakes, customized suits, etc., etc. The last category is design to order. And design to order are those products for which, when the customer places an order, the producer starts designing the product. So architects are an example that only when the customer places an order, you start designing the house for them. So for all these different kinds of products, the best suited supply chain is a responsive supply chain, not an efficient supply chain. Efficient supply chain are predominantly for those products that are made to stock. Now, with that said, let me clear all the drawings. So with that said, there are different environments that are needed for an efficient supply chain versus a responsive supply chain. Generally, as I said earlier, the demand for an efficient supply chain based products is predictable. The demand for a responsive supply chain based products is unpredictable. It is difficult to predict demand for a product that needs a responsive supply chain. Generally, in an efficient supply chain, we prioritize low cost. In a responsive supply chain, we prioritize speed, whether it's the speed of development or the speed of delivery. So margins are generally higher in this one versus this one, and variety is generally higher in this one versus this one as well. That is generally a characteristic of the products itself. Now, moving on, and again, first I see other points. As I said earlier, generally for efficient supply chains, the strategy is make to stock. For a responsive supply chain, the strategy is either assemble to order, make to order, or design to order. The capacity questions are low. In an efficient supply chain, the capacity questions are generally higher in a responsive supply chain. And the reason is the same. Low variation in demand over here. Very high variation in demand. So to cope with that high variation, you need a very high cushion. And again, for lead times, basically the idea is to shorten them, but not at the expense of cost. Over here, the idea is to shorten the lead time aggressively. If you're selecting a supplier for an efficient supply chain, you would emphasize low prices. You would pick a supplier that gives you the lowest price. But if you're picking a supplier for a responsive supply chain, you would pick a supplier that gives you the fastest delivery. So in summary, in an efficient supply chain, the emphasis is on cost reduction. In a responsive supply chain, the emphasis is on faster speeds. Now, with that said, this brings us to an end of our discussion on supply chain management. In our discussion, we basically focused on two main components. What exactly do we mean by supply chain management? That was our first objective. And then second was, how do we differentiate between an efficient versus a responsive supply chain? I have assigned only 5 pages from the book. It is a very theoretical chapter. There are no problems in this chapter. Kindly go through these pages, go through my lecture as well, and let me know if you have any questions. And if you have any questions, either post them on the forum, on Titanium, or ask me the question during our weekly review session. Thank you. I will respond to your questions accordingly. Take care.